There is a joke that Dutch genealogists tell, half embarrassed, half proud. Some of the most common surnames in the Netherlands were never meant to be taken seriously at all. They were acts of quiet rebellion, written down in a hurry, under foreign orders, by people who assumed the whole system would collapse within a generation. It did not collapse. Those names survived. And now, 2 centuries later, DNA researchers are asking a stranger question underneath the joke. How far back do the actual bloodlines behind those names really go? The story people think they know starts in 1811, when Napoleon's administration, occupying the Netherlands, ordered every household to register a fixed, hereditary surname for the first time. Before that, most Dutch families used patronymics, a name built from the father's first name, changing every generation. A man named Jan, son of Peter, might be Jan Pietersen. His own son might become something entirely different. It worked for small communities. It was a bureaucratic nightmare for an empire trying to tax, conscript, and control a population. So the order went out. Choose a name. Make it permanent. And a portion of the Dutch population, resentful of foreign rule and quietly certain that Napoleon would not last, registered names that ranged from mundane to openly mocking, names describing pig farmers, names built from absurd wordplay, names that seemed designed to embarrass a bureaucrat 200 years later. For a long time, this was treated as the whole story. Dutch surnames were young, administrative, a little bit of historical comedy layered over otherwise ordinary Northern European ancestry. That was the accepted version. Surnames as paperwork. Ancestry as something that only really became traceable once the naming stabilized. Genealogists worked backward from 1811 parish and civil records, and for most families, the trail thinned out somewhere in the 1600s or 1700s, right around the edge of what people call the Dutch Golden Age, the era of Rembrandt, of the East India Company, of a small, marshy, flood-prone country that briefly became one of the wealthiest trading powers on earth. But here is where the first crack appears. Not in the names. In the land itself. The Netherlands sits on some of the most geographically unstable, historically overwritten ground in Europe. Rivers shifted. Coastlines drowned and reappeared. Entire regions were reclaimed from the sea centuries after the first waves of settlement. That means the population's history was never one continuous, orderly line moving from ancient tribe to modern Dutch citizen. It was interrupted, flooded, resettled, and layered again, repeatedly over thousands of years. Roman writers describe Germanic tribes living in the Delta region, the Batavians, the Frisians, the Chauci. Later came Frankish expansion, Saxon settlement in the east, Viking raids, and, in some coastal areas, Viking settlement. By the time surnames were finally locked in place in 1811, the underlying population had already absorbed centuries of quiet, unrecorded mixing that no parish register was ever going to capture. Genealogists using paper records alone could trace names. They could not trace the deeper population history sitting underneath those names, and for a long time, nobody expected they needed to. The records looked complete enough. The land looked settled. The story looked finished. Then researchers started sequencing DNA from living Dutch populations and comparing it not just to neighboring countries, but to itself, region by region. Autosomal DNA, the broad genetic inheritance drawn from both parents, turned out to be unusually sensitive to something almost nobody expected still to be detectable in a country this small and this densely connected. A 2014 genome-wide study of thousands of Dutch individuals found that genetic variation across the Netherlands still correlated with real statistical strength to medieval political and linguistic borders, old provincial boundaries, old church-diocese lines, even old dialect regions, despite modern infrastructure, modern mobility, and more than a century of internal migration. In a country roughly the size of a mid-sized American state, researchers could still detect meaningful genetic differences between someone from Friesland in the north and someone from Limburg in the south. In one of the most densely populated, well-connected nations on Earth, the genome had not fully blended the way common assumptions expected it to. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. It meant the deep regional identities, Frisian, Saxon, Frankish, Hollandic, were not simply cultural memories or dialect quirks. They were still, faintly but measurably, written into the DNA of people living in those regions today. The paternal line complicated things further. Y chromosome studies of Frisian populations in the northern Netherlands identified haplogroup patterns that closely matched populations in northern Germany and southern Scandinavia, a genetic echo of the historical accounts describing Frisians as a distinct North Sea coastal people with strong maritime and trade links across the Channel and into early medieval England. Meanwhile, populations in the southern and eastern Netherlands showed stronger genetic affinity with neighboring Belgian and Western German populations, consistent with a different, more continental Frankish and Saxon inheritance. Two supposedly Dutch regions, separated by a few hundred kilometers, carrying genetically distinguishable ancestral signatures that predate the nation of the Netherlands by well over 1,000 years. At this point, the tidy 1811 story, Dutch ancestry as something you can trace back through parish records and started to look much smaller than the reality underneath it. Researchers found themselves weighing several explanations for what the DNA was actually showing, and none of them fully replaced the others. One framework points to long-term regional continuity. Coastal, low-lying Dutch communities may descend, in significant part, from populations that adapted early to marshland and delta living, staying rooted in the same waterlogged territories for millennia while empires and religions changed around them. A second framework emphasizes admixture through trade and migration. The Netherlands' position at the mouth of the Rhine made it a magnet for Frankish, Saxon, Frisian, and later Huguenot, Sephardic Jewish, and Baltic trading populations, each wave blending into the existing genetic landscape without erasing what came before. A third framework, more provisional, suggests that some of the sharpest regional genetic boundaries may trace back even further than the medieval period, to earlier Iron Age or Roman-era tribal territories that quietly shaped where later Frankish and Saxon settlers chose to establish themselves, meaning some of what looks like medieval genetic structure may actually be an older skeleton the medieval world built itself around, rather than something the medieval period created from nothing. If you find it strange that a country this small can hold this many buried genetic borders, you are not alone, and if this kind of investigation interests you, it is worth sticking around, because very few nations have been mapped this closely at the regional level. The landmark moment for this field came from a large-scale collaboration often referred to as the Genome of the Netherlands project, which sequenced whole genomes from hundreds of Dutch individuals across multiple generations of the same families, allowing researchers to observe not just where genetic variation existed, but how recently certain ancestral signals had entered specific bloodlines. This mattered more than earlier, smaller studies because whole genome sequencing captures far more of the genetic picture than the limited marker panels used in previous decades, and because tracing multiple generations within the same families let researchers separate very old, deep ancestry from more recent, localized mixing. The project confirmed the regional genetic boundaries seen in earlier studies, but it also picked up something researchers had not expected to find so clearly preserved: distinguishable traces of Golden Age-era trade contact, including detectable ancestry signals linked to Sephardic Jewish communities who settled in Amsterdam after fleeing Iberia in the 16th and 17th centuries, and smaller, scattered signals connected to the Dutch East India Company's trading posts across Asia, carried home through generations of return migration and intermarriage. Here is the twist, and it is not the one the surname joke prepared anyone for. Researchers were not primarily surprised that the wealthy, cosmopolitan Golden Age had left a genetic footprint. A trading empire spanning Southeast Asia, the Americas, and Africa was always likely to leave some trace. The surprise was where the deepest, oldest genetic divisions actually sat. Not between Dutch and foreign. Between one Dutch province and another. The Golden Age turned out to be a relatively recent layer sitting on top of a much older, more fundamental set of regional identities, Frisian, Saxon, Frankish, that had never fully dissolved, even after centuries of a shared flag, a shared language, and a shared 1811 naming system designed to make everyone look administratively identical. Not a single Dutch bloodline. Not even a single Dutch ancestry. A confederation of older peoples, still faintly visible in the genome, wearing one national name. This matters beyond the Netherlands, because it undercuts a very common assumption. that small, modern, well-integrated nations must have simple, blended, homogeneous genetic histories. The Dutch case suggests the opposite can be true. Political unification does not erase deep regional ancestry. It just gives it a shared passport: migration, trade. Empires, religious refuge, and centuries of intermarriage did not flatten the Netherlands into one genetic population. They added new layers on top of older ones that were, and apparently still are, remarkably persistent. Picture the northern Dutch coast in late autumn, where the land barely rises above the waterline and the sky seems to take up more space than the ground. Sheep graze on man-made mounds called terpen, built by Frisian farming communities more than 2,000 years ago specifically to survive the floods that regularly swallowed the lower ground. Wind turbines now turn slowly above fields that Roman writers once described as barely habitable, populated by a stubborn coastal people who refuse to leave. Their descendants, in some measurable genetic sense, may still be standing there. 2,000 years of empires have passed over this coastline: Roman, Frankish, Burgundian, Spanish, Napoleonic, and the marshland people adapted, absorbed, renamed themselves in 1811 with whatever surnames seemed convenient at the time, and stayed. So the surnames were never really the story. They were paperwork, hurriedly assigned, sometimes as a joke, to populations whose actual ancestry stretched back through the Golden Age, through the medieval kingdoms, through Roman-era tribal frontiers, into a delta landscape that had been shaping the people living on it since long before anyone thought to write their names down at all. The DNA did not hand back a simple answer. It handed back something closer to a map with too many layers to flatten into one clean story: Frisian coast, Saxon east, Frankish south, Hollandic center, each with its own faint but persistent genetic signature, all folded together under a single national identity that is, historically speaking, remarkably young. The old story said Dutch ancestry began with a name written down under Napoleon's orders. The genome tells a slower, older story, one where the name was simply the last thing to arrive, stamped onto bloodlines that had already been shaped by 2,000 years of flood, migration, trade, and quiet, stubborn survival on some of the most difficult land in Europe. The map is not finished. It was never as simple as a surname suggested. And that, more than any joke about an 1811 registration office, may be the real inheritance worth uncovering. If you enjoy this kind of science-driven history, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which population's hidden ancestry you want uncovered next.